afternoon, everybody. Loved the talks this morning. Wanted to dive in more into the topic of trust. We have a fascinating discussion here about what that actually means, and we're going to pick up on some of the themes that Andres discussed this morning in his opening talk. And again, Nortal, thank you so much for supporting the event. Really appreciate it. We want to talk a little about the pillars of trust. And so I'm going to start by bringing up the poll that we put together earlier. And it's online, so you may have already seen it, but if you haven't, you can go ahead and vote in it using Mentimeter. I will show the QR code in the top right corner. So Andreas talked about 4 different factors that are the sort of 4 pillars of building trustworthy digital systems: reliability, transparency, fairness, and execution. If you haven't already voted, scan that QR code. You can go in and rate the 4 pillars by moving them up or down with a slider. And then once you've rated those, tell us which ones you think are most important, because we've had some discussions among ourselves about which ones of these needs to happen first, how you can prioritize these things, which ones are dependent on others. So I'm going to leave this here for a couple of minutes. The early winner right now, and this may change, is reliability, which I'm kind of surprised by as an analytics person, because I'm like, how do you know it's going to be reliable if you can't measure it? You need transparency before everything else. Mihkel, you've done a lot of work to study this kind of stuff at the academic level. So why don't you kick things off by talking a little bit about how do you even study trust?
Well, I mean, volumes have been written on it. It's a super difficult topic because when you think about it, I mean, what is actually trust? And there is a definition of it that it's your willingness to be exposed to the actions of someone without being able to control whether this person or this thing, technology, for example, acts in your best interest. That is definite trust. So when you think about that particular definition, then actually reliability really does pop up as the first. I mean, something gets done in your interest, basically, reliably, consistently. So that definitely is one central pillar there. But when you look at how different types of service, for example, look at trust, and people think of all kinds of different reference objects, meaning that you need to have very different experiences in order to form these trust opinions. But one thing that everyone actually experiences personally is actually getting the output or the outcome of the service. So that's a personal experience, whereas if you, for example, refer to experts who you trust and who say that this thing is trustworthy, then that's actually a personal experience. That's referring to some other object that tells you that this is trustworthy. So personal experience counts most, and when we look at this equation that Andres proposed, then actually this personal experience is the core there. So this really fits with what the research is showing as well.
So deputizing trust to someone else is nowhere near as solid as first-hand experience. Absolutely. Something we're probably seeing in the election right now. Many people are saying, how do you know, right? Andres, what are your thoughts on, like, did you stack rank these? I know your equation said they all have to be there, and if any of them is 0, then nothing works. But, and you know, you can, do you have any thoughts on which of these you have to focus on first?
I mean, I'm actually surprised that looking the outcomes here, this completely correlates with the other surveys. So the population of this audience here confirmed other studies at this point. Very interesting. It's, you know, not surprising, but interesting, simply also to see the scale here. I mean, the poll says it. The poll really says it. I mean, it's the reliability that creates the biggest. Mm-hmm. When we thought about the formula, then it was also even that we thought, like, should we have multipliers in front of it? Probably not, but it's a fair question that if that is so much bigger effect than anything else, then okay, it has a multiplying effect on everything else as well. But still, probably Mihkel can expand more on it, but the question is that, okay, that, you know, take away something else, what is then the impact of reliability? Can you have reliability if, for example, you fundamentally do not agree how the system works? That's a question.
You don't have a baseline to compare it against. All right, Elizabeth, you're going to put a Canadian voice on some of this. We always talk about this Estonian miracle, although I think, as someone said this morning, someone finally explained it, which was great. Tell me a little about how the government of Canada is thinking, or at least Service Design and ESDC is thinking about building trust with citizens.
Well, it's complex because like trust is we have to earn trust, right? And I think we're slowly building out new services and new platforms and new processes to kind of alleviate some of that pressure that we have in terms of building that trust. So like I do agree with the reliability. It's like when a person comes to the door, as long as they get the same result at the end is key to building that trust. And I think that's really slowly what we're trying to do is build that trust by building out our services better and more using client-centered design and product management and all these things and talking to our clients about how we're building this stuff, how we're building these things for them, and as we're slowly building that trust with them.
So is consistency a part of this? Or
Consistency.
Is it, because we often think of reliability as like the system doesn't crash.
Yeah.
But this sounds like what you're saying is more of a predictability.
Yeah. It's like you're relying, that service is going to be the same every time you come back.
Okay. So,
regardless of the program too, because we have a lot of programs. We have lots of them, but we should be delivering them all in a similar, consistent way.
Is there a particular program within ESDC that you think is a good example of like a trust building program?
Well, I had to say, like the stuff that we've done with the Canadian dental program, I think there was really a push to implement them using client-centered design and all that stuff, and it's been really positive. So using that as a really good example of like how we can slowly build those things. It wasn't a big bang.
What have you built there? Tell me about the.
The Canadian dental.
Yeah.
So it was a new program by the current government to offer dental for any Canadian, essentially, because right now it's for private industry. So now it's paying for those things for people that are under a certain or within a certain rate of pay.
Sure.
Essentially.
So what is the service incorporate?
The service is like you have to sign up, and then you'll get a benefit essentially to pay for your dental care.
And so, what are the steps in that kind of service that you had to test?
Oh, well, we tested the whole process. So we tested the application process. We tested just the online portion, like how they view, how they see their benefit. And I think that's all right now. There's going to be different phases to the program that's going to be implemented. So I think the first 2 have been implemented, and those were tested. The application process was the biggest piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so you're doing sort of testing along these different attributes. Did you get any kind of metrics afterwards to understand, what people thought, how trustworthy it was? Like, what do you do what were your North Star metrics for that process?
Ooh, well, it wasn't necessarily my project, so I don't have those direct metrics, but from what I understand is that they were really positive, and it's been a good program that went forward.
You were like surveying people who'd used it or collecting?
Not just survey, but user testing, talking directly with them.
Okay. So we have a second question that I wanted to bring up here as part of this poll. There are obviously a lot of obstacles to getting trust working properly. We've proposed a few of them here. I'll put the QR code up again in case you need it. But we hypothesize that the big topics that might be causing problems are delay. The biggest obstacles to building trust are delay and cost overruns, meaning like I ran out of budget or it took too long to build it. Services being too hard to use, meaning it works, but like I can't navigate and find my way through it. Black box processes, so not really understanding what the system is doing, where things are happening sort of opaquely in the background. System instability or technology issues, that would be like it's up, it's down, sometimes it crashes, things like that. Data privacy concerns, meaning I don't know what's being done with my data or it's asking too much of me. And then no public performance metrics, meaning I don't have any data on how many people were able to complete the task or what it cost or other kinds of information about the service. We kind of figured these were 6 things that might work as categories or sources of obstacles. I'm sure there are others, but I thought it would be interesting to see what people thought was the biggest thing that would undermine trust based on your talk this morning, Andres. And it looks like difficulty in using the service is the biggest thing that undermines it. Is that what you found, or do you think there are other things that?
Yeah, this is completely so. I mean, this is again the reliability.
Yeah.
So simplicity.
But reliability is a nuanced term, right? I could say reliability is the system isn't stable. I could say reliability is it's hard to use. So those are both sides of reliability.
Yeah, but
right?
we need to look at it from the outcomes point of view. From your point of view, what is reliable? And that all drives down like fundamentally that you have consistency in the service usage and it does things for you that are valuable.
But would you rather have a system that's super easy to use, but it's not always up, sometimes it's down, or a system
Then it's not reliable.
or a system that is always up but harder to use?
I think both of them actually contribute still to the same KPI, that what is your experience with it in the end. So whatever is the reason, if it doesn't work or if it's hard to use, still your satisfaction suffers from it. So that's the key, that's the KPI there. There was earlier, you talked about like what are the product KPIs, that how to measure all of this. This is also, I think, that you can consistently see that the product teams or the service teams that are setting their goal or what they're measuring is the satisfaction and trust in the end, they are actually optimizing the work process towards creating it. So that's something like in the, in the product school of thought, that the companies or the teams that are able to do that, they are actually delivering on those outcomes better. So that's the primary thing, what to optimize somehow.
I'm surprised to see that no public performance metrics is very low as an obstacle to trust. I would have thought that, being able to tell that the system is working well for others or that it is coming in under budget and things like that would be part of the public record, would matter a lot for trustworthiness.
Very interesting as well, yes. I mean, but probably actually again proves the point that let's be honest, I mean, majority of people isn't necessarily interested in being consulted in service design, for example. Right. Participation probably, I would say, is a bit overrated. In the end, people want to get results out of services, and if you have this public performance metric, that is again something that, let's say, should show you that how in general or in the aggregate actually government is performing. Whereas when I think about my own personal issues, I want those to be solved, and I probably want to have as little contact with government office as possible, because that means that actually all my needs are taken care of. The rest, yes, this is obviously important in order to measure the performance from the service delivery point of view, but the individual citizens don't really necessarily pay too much attention. And again, I would say that is something that we have to keep in mind, that in the end we can set these goals, how to perform better as an organization, but the end customer, that's what really matters, and they perform, or they form those opinions based on their own personal experience, where it's a easy, well-to-use service that delivers the result.
Are there any initiatives? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And also, maybe to expand on this, I mean, last year, the OECD Trust Survey, not this year, but last year, had a really awesome indicator that what is the relevance of adoption of innovation on trust. It had the lowest impact. So adoption of new technologies doesn't move the needle.
Oh, wow.
What moves the needle is actually what outcomes does it produce. So if anybody tells me that adoption of blockchain somewhere has created vast trust for the society, I'd like to see a study that confirms it.
Right.
But that's the key point there, that it's the outcomes, but not the technologies that change trust. So.
And maybe it's also, it's not, those are like just the ways to get there. Like, they may not be super important for us as regular people navigating a system, but doesn't mean that we shouldn't have that stuff available. And it's known that they could go find it if needed or whatnot. And publicly, like, I don't think we have, should we do ATIPs or access to information requests and all this stuff to find out this stuff? It should be available to them, but maybe it's just not as important for them to see, like, right in their face.
There's an expectation that, like, the journalists will cover that. They'll let me know if it's the big deal. The journalists have data, and they'll tell me if there's a problem of some kind. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So we have questions here that are, feel free to use the QR code if you have questions for the group here. Elizabeth, maybe you can talk a little about at ESDC in general, when you're doing service delivery, because I know you're in the service sort of design and delivery area. Early on in the requirements setting phase, what are the kinds of questions and metrics that you put in place to measure trust? And is that changing? Are you changing how you test whether a service is successful?
So we don't do requirements on my team. Gross. We very much follow product management practices. So we really start out with outcomes. Like, what is the key outcome that we're trying to achieve in building out this new project or product that we're trying to deliver? So that's where we start off, is like, what's the problem we're trying to solve, and what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? And then from there, we really build out KPIs on how we're going to get there. And those will shift over time as we develop the product and we release certain iterations of the product. So that's something that we're trying to build across. It's fairly new. Still, it's not very new practice in terms of building out, like, time on task and reliability and sus scores and things like that. So we're trying to bring it really within the product lens and doing it outcome focused. So it's still new, it's relatively new, but we're trying to change the needle, basically.
So if you have a set of requirements, I don't want to call them requirements, but you have an outcome you're building towards, how often do you need to go back to the person that said you'd like that outcome and push back on the constraints to say what you're asking for is impossible unless the legislation changes, versus is the legislation or the policy that you're trying to implement aligned already? Like, how often you have to go, I'm sorry, you're asking for a hoverboard that can't exist?
I think it's always a push and pull, because I think there's always a way. I don't like to look at legislation as a barrier. I think there's always a way around it. And it's a conversation that we have to have with our policymakers and legal teams and stuff like that. There's always a way around the legislation so we can still implement a good service.
But
so
I think saying there's a way around legislation.
Not not going against legislation.
But shouldn't you just go back to the legislator and say, I'm sorry, that's not possible? Or is that too hard to do or politically unappetizing?
No, I don't think it's a matter of that. I really don't. I don't think, we enact some legislative pieces, and legislation doesn't change often, right? So the stuff that we have right now, we have to work within those boundaries. And I think the way that we draft legislation is slowly changing to make sure that we're not creating massive barriers. I haven't seen it in our daily work, but it's just a matter of having a conversation of what the impact is and how we can navigate it so we can deliver a good service.
So, Andres, when you've implemented some of these things, how much of your work has been implementing a new service versus using an existing service and improving it to build trust?
First of all, expand on the last one. That one interesting aspect, when you talked about regulations and legal changes, then actually it's much easier to change regulations if you have higher trust. So it just constantly comes up that, okay, how do we get started? That a lot of the things that we want to do require certain policy and regulative changes. But this is where somehow there is a feedback loop that if you have a higher trust environment, then it's actually much easier also to do policy changes later on. It's simply the question of how to get started. Now coming to that part, that what's let's say, the ratio between the new services versus existing services? That's a very interesting question, because we have to understand that fundamentally most governments offer same services. Fundamentally, there are certain policy changes, specifics. What are the taxes that you have? What are the social benefits exactly what you have? But fundamentally, governments have very similar functions and very similar high-level services. We can say that all of us are improving an existing system fundamentally. Very rarely that there is actually something completely new, that somebody thought of a completely new policy instrument that has never been done before. Very rare. So it's mostly improvements.
Is there ever a time where you just look at a system and it's so broken you rip it out and replace it with something? For example, Ukraine's DIA software, the country has gone very high up in the digital government rankings. The technology is fairly well distributed. USAID is now exporting it to other countries. Even though the US can't force people to use things domestically, they're bringing it to other countries in the hope of widening democracy. At what point does the government go, our legacy is so broken that we need to bring in a parallel new system and move to that?
But that's a new service delivery channel, simply.
Right.
A newer service delivery channel. But fundamentally, the services underneath, from the policy point of view, are still the same. Social benefits, driving license, whatever they are, they're still the same. But yes, we need to adopt newer technologies to provide services to citizens at the places where the citizens are, mobile, for example. But
it's also things like, if you're using a single platform, now you're logged in across those services so that they can be much more easily used than having to go. I mean, you may not have tried to do something in Canada, but it requires going to multiple websites with multiple logins, often receiving an email to tell you there's a message for you so that you can go log in to read that message.
Yeah, there are very good arguments why this type of service delivery is much more reliable. But coming to that point, that the legacy question, I mean, every single government in the world has a legacy problem, unless somebody can, start a completely new country from scratch, which is very unlikely. But every government has a legacy problem, and it's really the question, how do you approach the legacy problem? I like the comparison with a city, that imagine that you want to do some sort of radical transformation of a city. You don't throw out the existing city and then start a new city. You do gradual improvements to a city. And this is exactly the same way how we need to look at the legacy that exists in larger organizations, piece by piece, encapsulate something, build something across it, build a better interface on top of it. We shouldn't try to solve the legacy problem in a way that will simply start anew. I haven't seen in my career a place where this makes sense. It's gradual improvements and figuring out how can we live with the legacy and build a sustainable way how to continuously do the improvements, also the underlying architecture. A lot of the thinking goes, again, to the city planning. How are we planning and improving our cities?
Yeah, and it echoes some of what Brian was saying this morning about the tech stack, which is you've tackled continuous improvement first because that becomes your lever for all the other sources of change.
Yeah, and also from an architectural point of view.
So we have a few questions from the audience. I'm going to pick the first one here. How do you build, this is really a couple of questions merged together. How can you build trust after losing it again? For example, Phoenix or the Indigenous people of Canada who've suffered at the hands of the government and obviously have significant levels of mistrust. How do you go about rebuilding trust?
That's a tricky one.
It is tricky.
I can ask an easier question if you'd like.
It's so complex to build that trust, but it takes time, first of all. And I think it takes a lot of engagement and a lot of bringing people together to solve problems at the base of it. At the core, like just not even a digital space, but just like core societal, cultural shift. It's like we need to make the changes together and not in a silo is how we're going to start building trust or regaining the trust, I guess.
Maybe there is a pattern that is applicable in that scenario from somewhere else. For example, one instrument that has worked out is, for example, I earlier touched that like people are adverse to complex changes, for example, adoption of new technologies. I mean, statistics shows that if we go to the cities and start telling about AI, the reaction is not the best, actually. We're tech geeks. For us, of course it is, but the regular people, not so much. And the same is with everything, that like the best services are the ones that don't kind of, let's say, try to make the technological breakthrough like so visible, but actually just make it work. So I think with inclusion, it's the same. We just need to make it work and not make a thing by itself. That in the technology world, at least, this is the way how to also integrate AI, for example, into services. That might overlap also in the other areas.
Mihkel, in your research, what is the lever that most rebuilds trust?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, partially probably also how you, let's say, when we talk about digital government, obviously heavily depends on technology. Partially also how you deal with crises that hit. I mean, I'm sort of thinking maybe a bit too much of the Estonian examples, but I mean, for example, we have internet voting. Actually, sort of question to the audience. So what country in the world is number one in terms of the nominal number of people who have the possibility to vote over the internet?
What country is the number one country in the world in terms of the number of people who can vote via the internet?
Yeah. I mean, Estonia is really tiny, so everyone has the right to vote over the internet. So actually, don't come first. You might be surprised that it's actually Canada, because of local elections in Ontario and Nova Scotia actually use internet voting a lot, and the nominal number of people who have the right to vote over the internet is actually biggest there globally. Not too many Canadians actually know that as well. But Estonian internet voting hit a major crisis in 2017 when the digital ID system, which partially back then was still, let's say, or the biggest ID mode that was used was a smart card, produced by a global company that had produced, this key generating process there was faulty. Essentially meant that this was made public like 1.5 months before the election. And it was dealt with in a very transparent manner. There were fears that, okay, that's going to be the end of...
Private key was revealed a month and a half before election.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
I mean, it was, the keys were 2 weak, meaning you could, with a reasonable amount of computing power, compute the private key from the public key.
Wow.
Which is a major flaw. I mean, more than 1 billion cards worldwide were affected by it. But it was dealt in a very transparent manner. And as a result, I mean, elections came up, people thought that, okay, that's going to be the end of internet voting because they don't trust the ID anymore. It hit another record, actually, because it was dealt in a transparent manner, it was fixed, nothing was hidden. So if you sort of deal with these crises that hit as well in a very transparent, consistent manner, that actually helps to make trust a bit more resilient, or let's say robust. Meaning, if it sort of goes down, really hard to rebuild, but at least to keep it at a certain level, it's not like rocket science, actually.
So, but I like the idea that it's a crisis. You deal with the crisis in an unexpectedly good way and publicize that you did, and that rebuilds trust. How does that dovetail with what you said earlier about it's much easier to lose trust than to gain it? Like, can you manufacture trust by finding crises and fixing them?
I think so, yes, actually. That in Estonia, for example, there is, from time to time, there is in a media, there is a news that somebody was misusing your data. I think the paradox here is that that actually creates trust, because people know that they don't get away with it. If you have silence, if you have radio silence, you don't know.
So I think the answer, if I hear it right, is consequence.
Yeah.
Wow.
But also, I mean, how do you know that things are transparent?
Right.
How do you know that?
I guess there's an assumption of
I think
corruption.
media has a place in
and
it.
if you have a sufficient enough examples of people being caught, then you're like, oh, the system is working.
I think so. I mean, how do you know?
It's a weird paradox, because no perfect system can exist, because then it's not showing signs of corruption.
I mean, that goes to the free speech. It goes to the overall how the democracy works.
Yeah.
Very deep.
Awesome. Fascinating to explore this stuff. I like the ideas of, it's how you respond to a crisis, of demonstrating consequence as ways of regaining trust. I think those are all things that we can take home to some of the challenges we're seeing in Canada for building public services. Thank you all very much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.